Hey everyone, Josh Mills here. This is going to be the basic retouching in Capture One before export to Photoshop for advanced retouching using frequency separation and dodge and burn. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Capture One and jump right in with you here. As you can see, I've got a selection of images from the headshot workstation with Christian at the workshop. And I'm actually going to go ahead and use the same image that I was using as the example during the retouching part of the workshop. So I'm going to go ahead and select that guy right there. And this image, as you can see, is straight out camera. It's zeroed out. There's been no changes applied to it yet. So let's go ahead and jump right on into it. The first thing that I'll always do with all of my images whenever I bring them in here is I go to the lens correction panel and I will check off that chromatic aberration. The reason I do that is just to get rid of the chromatic aberration. If you don't know what that is that purple and green fringing that happens on sharp edges where there is really dramatic contrast between bright and dark. So if this did have chromatic aberration in this image, which it doesn't, you would really notice it, say, right along the hairline where there are sharp edges against a dark background. And it would look like that, almost like a 3D movie without your glasses on, where it's like the image is layered but slightly misaligned. And it would be a purple or green fringe. Like I said, this image doesn't have it, but just out of habit, I always do this so I don't have to worry about it. I'm going to go ahead and minimize that out so we can go ahead and go through the other parts here. You have a couple sliders here. Distortion is how you would counterbalance the distortion caused by using shorter focal length lenses, like, you know, a fisheye or a short like 20 or 24 millimeter. And whenever you click on it, you see the grid come up, and this allows you to see how your distortion really is affected. A good purpose for this is especially if you have straight lines like in your image, and you'll see like a bow to those lines because of the distortion of the lens. This allows you to counterbalance it and straighten out those lines. Obviously, I shot this with an 85. I don't have any lines distorted, so I don't have to worry about correcting that distortion here. Next would be your sharpness. I nailed the focus on this shot, and I always check on the eye because that's what I'm using as my focus point anyways. So you can see I nailed focus here. If you didn't nail focus and it was slightly soft, you could sharpen up the image using the sharpness slider. But I have no need for it at this point. So I'm just not going to touch that at all right now. And let's zoom back out so we can talk about light fall off. Light fall off allows you to counterbalance that natural vignette of your lens, which is that darkness that you see creeping in from, I gotta get rid of that brush. That darkness that you see creeping in from the edges of your frame. I like that look. It actually helps to bring the attention to the center, to your subject in the frame. But this is how you would counterbalance it, especially if you're doing a high key image where that really draws away from that high key look. If you move the slider, you see how those edges are now being brightened by this slider. That's to counteract that darkness or the vignette created by your lens naturally. I'm leaving it off because I actually intentionally want that vignette in this image. And from there, I just want to cover a few other things here. Right here we have rotation and flip, and we also have crop. I never crop my images until they are final edits, because sometimes I've found that if I crop them before my final edit, I wish that I had more that is not there anymore. And if I go back to the original, now I have parts of the image that are not edited and parts that are. So I don't crop before working on an image, I do the edit in full and then crop as the very last step before exporting to file. The rotation and flip, good example here. You can see that the lines in the background that run horizontally are just slightly tilted clockwise. You can use this to straighten up the image, especially if you have vertical or horizontal lines that are not quite level. So, I could straighten this up, just so you see what's going on here, by using those grid lines that come up when I click on it to line up the lines behind him. And it looks like I've got it straight there. Nope, just a touch more. There we go. Nice and level across there. And just so you can see how much of a change that -1.2 actually is, I'm going to hold down the Alt key on my keyboard while clicking the reset up here. What that does is it just temporarily resets as long as I'm holding that Alt key down. So you can see just that -1.2 change completely levels out those lines in the background. I'm actually going to get rid of that and just move on. The next thing I would do after my lens correction is go over to the exposure panel. In the exposure panel, you have quite a few things to choose from here. I'm going to start off with just the two basic ones that I always use. You've got the exposure, you've got the high dynamic range. The exposure, obviously, is your exposure, contrast, brightness, and saturation. Now, for these images, when you're shooting flash photography, I always highly recommend you try and nail your exposure in camera. Don't rely on the dynamic range of your camera and the raw file to correct for your under or overexposure. You have control over that light, so shoot it and try to shoot it with the exact exposure that you want for that image. All right? So that being said, let me go through the sliders. Exposure is a global heavy-handed setting. It affects the entire image, highlights, shadows, all the same. So it is very heavy-handed. Everything changes in here. It blows out the highlights quickly. It takes those shadows way too dark. It is a global. So I never touch that exposure slider. Contrast is another heavy-handed slider. It basically enhances the dark and light parts of the image to add contrast to your image. As you can see, it is very heavy-handed. If I go way over here, I lose a lot. I go way over here, it softens the image and makes it look very unnatural. One thing I will say about that, a lot of people that don't go into Photoshop, that just use Lightroom or Capture One, especially if they're shooting females and want it to be a soft feminine image, they will bump that contrast down because it does soften up that image. I see nothing wrong with that. I just don't prefer to do that with my own images. Now let's move on down to brightness. Brightness is one that I actually will use. If I am slightly underexposed, I will use the brightness because it's a more conservative. You can see it's not as heavy-handed as exposure. And it's a good way to bring up the exposure of the image very naturally looking without blowing out highlights, without really affecting the shadows with a heavy hand. Last thing you've got obviously is saturation. This is a global saturation. It affects every color in every amount of brightness across the image. So you can see that everything gets affected by it. I don't usually mess with saturation here because I can adjust it in my Photoshop retouching. I can also adjust it in something I'm going to show you in a few moments here in Capture One. I'm also very happy with the saturation of this image directly out of camera, so I don't really have a reason to mess with that. What I am going to adjust here is the high dynamic range. When shooting flash photography, you tend to get these specular highlights. And in these specular highlights, there is skin texture and detail that is there, but it's hidden because of how bright the highlight is. So pretty much almost 100% of the time when I'm shooting flash photography, I will take this highlight slider up anywhere between 25 to 50 to really take that specularity out and bring the textures back into them. The shadow slider in the high dynamic range is another one where this is a great tool that I'm not going to use on this image specifically, but it's very useful whenever you have an image that has very dark regions but very bright highlights, and you can't use the brightness or exposure to open up the shadows because you will end up blowing out your highlights and losing the detail there. So the shadow allows you to basically adjust the exposure of the shadow and expose those details without blowing out your highlights in the rest of the image. This image was intentionally set up and shot this way. I love the contrast of this dark background and the exposure of his platinum hair and face, so I'm not going to adjust the shadows this time. Levels. Levels you've probably seen in Lightroom and also as one of the layers in Photoshop. I don't usually adjust levels in my raw processing engine, Lightroom or Photoshop, or Capture One or Camera Raw, Adobe Camera Raw. Occasionally I will adjust curves. This is where you get the S curve. So you can throw a center point in there, you can bring up your highlights, bring down your shadows, and give that image a contrast on a very fine-tuned way. So you can actually see, I just put a slight S curve in here, and I will show you the difference here by temporarily resetting by holding the Alt key on the keyboard while clicking the mouse. See, I've given that image some contrast, but in a much more natural way than using the contrast slider up under the exposure section. I'm not going to do it to this image because I actually don't want that contrast. I like it the way it was shot, so I'm going to reset that and then move on down here to clarity. Clarity, this is another annoyance that I see a lot of people do. There are so many people, they love that HDR look. They don't understand how to shoot HDR, true HDR, so they just take an image and they come in here and they crank clarity up to 100%. That is not HDR, that's fake HDR. It looks horrid to me. Clarity is another heavy-handed tool that if I use it at all, I use it very, very mildly. I usually will not go above 5, 10 at max, and it's only just to give a little bit of extra pop to the image. I'm not going to use it on this image, obviously. I just wanted to discuss it. Don't go up there and crank it up to a 100. I mean, if you want to go up to 25, 30, then you start getting into that point where you're starting to reach that fake HDR look. So like I said, go very conservative if you're using the clarity slider and keep it in that 5 to 10 range max. That's covered now, so I'm going to take you to the final thing that I would do in the basic retouching in here before going into Photoshop. So we'll go back over here to the color, and this is where you're going to set your white balance. As you can see, I've got as shot in camera, so this is the white balance as it came out of camera right now. If you click the drop down here in Capture One, you've got a bunch of presets that allow you to set some automatically chosen presets, for white balance. But I'm gonna go back to shot because I had that white balance set where I wanted it. With the exception of one thing I noticed once I imported in here. At some point, I guess I set my white balance to be slightly green in the tint. I don't remember why, but I did, and I'm gonna correct it now. I know that my camera proper white balance in it most of the time is in that -0.5 to -1. So right now, this image is actually just slightly green, and I can see it in some of these platinum areas. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop this back to that -0.5, just to go ahead and give me more of a balance between the green and magenta and more of a natural color to my eye. Another thing that I do notice is that I love the platinum color of Chris's hair, and it's a little bit warm. There's a little bit too much warmth to that for me here, so I can see my white balance temperature was a little bit warm. I'm actually gonna guess that I need to drop that down, let's say 4600. Nice. That is actually a little bit on the cool side. It's not a true white balance as if I had a gray card and, you know, actually balanced the image. It would actually be a warm image if I did that. I like this cool look because it takes that yellow out of this platinum that I love, and it also keeps that steel blue color in the background. And then you've got the nice contrast of the complementary skin tones of that orange and red to that almost tealish blue hue of the back. So it's a nice complement. So now that I've set my white balance here, I can sit here and go, all right, I like the look of this image. I want to apply it across all of my select images because I know they all have the same exposure and everything because my settings did not change while shooting. So I'm going to highlight all of them, click on the adjustments up here, choose copy and apply adjustments. It will automatically select all of the adjustments that I just made. And so I can just click apply, and it will apply it across all of the images I selected. At this point, I'm ready to export my images. So what I would do is I would go over here to the output, and under the output panel is where we choose how and where we want to export our images and what we want to do with them afterwards. I obviously take mine directly into Photoshop, so I am going to export in a huge file as a TIFF at 16 bits to keep all the information there for me to work with. I'm going to keep it uncompressed because I don't want an algorithm compressing the image and destroying some of the information I have to work with. I'm going to change it from sRGB to Adobe RGB, which gives me more colors in the color palette of the file. I'm going to make sure my resolution stays at the native resolution of the image that came out of my camera, so it is 300 pixels per inch. And I'm going to make sure that it stays at a fixed scale of 100%. I don't want the program to upscale or downscale the image. I want it exactly as it came out. And that brings us down to one other thing I want to point out. You will probably notice that in the open with, you have nothing selected by default. Right here, if you choose, you can choose another editor so that once you process these images and they are exported, it will automatically open that program for you and open those images in that program for you, so you can go directly into editing them there rather than going and finding the folder that those images were exported to and then opening them that way into the software. If you need to know where your photos were exported to, by default they export to the output folder, which is inside the session folder that you imported your images into. And if you don't know where that folder is, all you have to do is look down at the sample path and it will show you exactly where that is. Or you can click this little arrow next to destination and it will open up that folder for you where those images are exported to. So I'm actually going to deselect these because I want to show you the export directly into Photoshop. So let's go ahead and we're going to just work on that image that I worked on as the example. I've got all of my settings here. I've got it to automatically open in Photoshop, and I'm going to go ahead and click process. It's going to process the image, export it to that output folder, and then immediately open that exported file, that TIFF file, in Photoshop for me. You see it's opening up Photoshop automatically. I didn't have to go and open Photoshop. And now it's going to open that image directly into Photoshop. There we go. We finished the basic corrections in Capture One and then brought it directly in Photoshop to continue with the heavy full-on retouch using frequency separation and dodge and burn. And that pretty much wraps it up for what I use Capture One for. Thank you guys.